Hello, hello. We are back. My friend and colleague, and my, in some ways, I suspect much better half, Julian Roberts. Hello, Julian.
Hello, Nancy. Good to see you again.
Always good to see you, and welcome to everyone else. We are here to talk about a COVID related, but perhaps newly evergreen topic is how do you onboard new people into your organization when you've been doing it remotely? With the press and the pressure and the desire to continue remote work, and probably a big movement in talent, I wouldn't be surprised if this is an ongoing question. So, Julian, what are your thoughts about best practices as well as perhaps a couple of pitfalls to avoid?
Yeah, what am it's an interesting topic. I think onboarding generally is an interesting topic. So I think it in itself is important. The remote side of things, and I endeavour think it will be an evergreen in the current climate that we operate in, certainly for the next few years. It's interesting. I always go back to my own ways, how I onboarded and my own experiences, because I think that's always a good place to start with these things. And I used to have some questions when I was employing somebody or bringing them into the organization, although onboarding starts way before people join, just so put it out there, really.
Well, it should.
It should do. So there's a process, but the sort of things I tend to think about is, what is the experience do I want these employees to have when they join or engage within the organization? So at the very outset, because that's really important, their experience. And then I think about who should they meet, who should they engage with, who should they sort of get alongside with, who's important in their role and in the world they're going to operate within the organization. And then I think about things like, what are the key aspects of the role that's operational? What are the key sort of strategic things they need to know about? Values, beliefs, all that sort of stuff's really important. And so I start to ask those questions. I think that's relevant whether that's remotely or in person. So that for me, that sort of galvanizes that sort of those principles. The challenge remotely becomes the sort of the how bit, and I think this is the executional bit. And I think it is more challenging in some ways, but it is possible because it is happening. I've talked to many clients who've been onboarding or been onboarded themselves remotely and had a very successful thing. And I know you're dying to jump in there, but I'm just going to give you three.
How could you tell?
I know. I'm going to give you.
I'm going to give you a few job of restraining myself.
I know. I'm going to give you a few things for you to sort of have a go at as well. But
right.
For me, the word is having the right tech with the right time, as in not 3 days after you've joined, way before, delivered tech training. An important thing for me with all this is having them some form of almost direct line, either a tech buddy, tech contact they can, because that's how you got to operate. You've got to operate through the tech. So if you can't access Zoom, you can't access whatever platform you're using, things are going to fail in fundamentally. And that's, to me, the absolute fundamental of remote working or onboarding is getting the tech right and making sure people really work that through. So I guess, what are your thoughts on that from your own experiences?
Well, I think it can be very isolating. I've had several clients who have started in either typically very senior roles, including a CEO or a senior vice president role. And there's a lot of confusion about what their job is sometimes and how to connect with their people. Because, of course, as always, you are right, Julian, in that the right way to approach this is, this week, my friend, okay, is to have it all figured out and have a repeatable process that has worked well. However, in my experience, that's the exception. And especially if you're sort of a smaller, or perhaps you pride yourself on being a more nimble and agile organization, they don't tend to focus on those kinds of things. So I think I would suggest a couple of things, both for the individual and for the organization. I totally agree with you about the tech, right? But let's say the tech is the tech. It's something somewhat familiar. Then I think they need a sort of onboarding buddy, like right away. Like someone who hopefully is safe harbor to go to with their questions about how does this joint really work? Because that's the kind of things you could observe once you are all together, but you really can't observe if you're new and apart. So I think that's one good thing to think about. I think the second is if you're their manager or main point of contact, is to have more frequent check-ins than you would think you would need. And also to be sure to include in those check-ins whom that person needs to get to know. Like, who are the critical cross-functional colleagues that will, in a sense, make or break their success, because we do depend on other areas and other departments for the work we do, right? Even though no man or woman is an island, we might as well all be on our own island right now. So I think it's the organization and the leader's job to tend to that person a little bit more than they would have to if everybody was all in the office together. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah,
Or
the body piece is really important. I mean, when I used to have people in person onboarding, I'd almost have somebody. I didn't call it a buddy then. I'm not entirely sure what I called it, but somebody who they would sort of go towards. But I think even now, in a remote sense, having somebody you literally can call up and say, "Look, I don't know how this works. What's going on here?
Yeah.
I'm not so sure about this meeting." And it might be somebody in the team, might be a peer, might be more helpful in that sense, or somebody in a similar role in a different team. But somebody they can literally call frequently, like, and almost don't feel they're bothering the manager all the time in that sense, and feel completely approachable. And I think that's quite vital, I think, because and you made a very good point about that continuous checking, because normally in an office, you know, we're wandering around, aren't we? And we're just sort of having a coffee with somebody quickly. You see somebody who's just joined, how you getting on? You might have a few 2-minute chat with them, and then you carry on. I think it's got to be more deliberate in the remote world, because clearly you're not going to be doing that in the sort of space world. You've got to literally give them a call and say, look, how are we getting on this? And I think what comes with this also in this remote sense onboarding is not only you've got to have some sort of schedule, and that's sort of relevant for any onboarding, you know, a schedule of who the meeting, what the meeting, why the meeting, it, all the schedule of the actual plan. But for the manager really to sort of sit down and go through some of the expectations for the next, say 30 days, if that's relevant for the job. What are they expecting from them? What sort of feedback? And also almost turn it around and saying, what are they expecting from the manager in terms of communication? How's best to contact with you? And perhaps to set some sort of goals in the role, in the context. Knowing full well the first few weeks is all about immersing you in the organization. And I think that's important rather than just cracking on with the job, so to speak. But I think it's important to put some milestones down just so you can just check in, are we making some progress here? And just develop the way to communicate and how often, I think is important. So that communication piece, and do you know what? It's vital in any remote setting now, is this sort of somehow dialogue and creating ways that you can expose people to that conversation.
I think what you're pointing out, Julian, is that is always best practice. That's made even more important in a remote environment. You'll be pleased to know that I have just thought of a problem to throw at your feet. Right?
Oh, we like problems.
I know you live for them. All right. And I'm going to call this the problem of two fishes. Okay. Fish number one. Okay. We hire someone from outside our organization because we think we need fresh blood and new ways of thinking. And what a surprise. After 6 months, we don't understand why that person doesn't fit in. Right? So like a new species in the fishbowl with all the other fish who have been swimming around, the ecosystem tends to reject that poor fish. Right? So how do you prevent that from occurring? Because it's even harder for that new fish to get to know the limits and the contours of that fishbowl. The other fish problem I'm going to call the smack the smelly fish on the floor problem, which I very great visual, right? I just thought of this. Now, I have both of those senior executives I was referencing who started. They have immediately figured out what's wrong with their new organization. And it's typically a process. And all they can do, they see it, they identify it, they complain about it, but they can't change it. Now, they may be completely off base about this, but they don't have all the other information they would normally have. They're watching it remotely from afar. They're comparing it to where they just left. They don't see the greater context. And all of a sudden, they think there's a smelly fish problem in the organization, and it creates kind of friction and drag and more criticism. So, since I pulled those out of the air for you and slapped you around with two herrings, do you have any thoughts on that kettle of fish?
Well, I think first you made a real valid point actually,
I
and
did.
that's you did in terms of when you join a company in the virtual sense, which often people are now, you only get in a zone of visual understanding of what is going on truly, because how you're interacting, whether you see that on a group meeting on Zoom, the odd phone call, and I think it's probably a bigger problem than people realize actually. So I think you've hit on something that's important to address and how you do that. And I think all these things, if somebody does spot something untoward or not, and the key thing is obviously to get some sort of airtime of that and in a conversation in an open way, because it might not be true, it might not be there really, because they're just missing something. But I think it's to explore, isn't it? And it's to have it an opportunity, and that's where the line manager sort of relationship needs to sort of create that dialogue that says, look, what are you spotting from your perspective? Because in fact, we brought you in to spot things because there may be things they spotted that are relevant to change, but actually it may be just them just getting a different perspective. And that's where they need to start interacting with more people. And it just may take a little bit longer than normal. And that's always a thing of these things. And I think that's where you've got to judge things a bit slower, because you can't get the full picture, because you're seeing aspects, then you're having a conversation, concerns, and then you need to perhaps have more conversations and to get a fuller picture, or join other teams. And I think it's quite a challenge, actually. It really is a challenge.
Yeah, I think, though, that we are suggesting two things that are actually very virtuous as well for the person who is onboarding, right? The first, and the organization, I suppose, as well. The first is patience. This is going to take longer and may happen more in spurts than it would continuously if it were not remote. So patience. The second thing that I believe we're suggesting is to suspend judgment when you're being onboarded, right? You are not getting a quote unquote natural view of that process within the organization, because this is it's not how they usually work. And so although you may be quick to judge it, as you say, you're not really getting the full contextual flavor of what's going on, which is also takes some self-management as well as patience, right? But, and by the way, we haven't even mentioned, if you do go back to the office, is that a second onboarding for you? Because in a way, it kind of is, isn't it? I mean, you're not.
It is. Well, that's everybody really in some ways.
Right. It really is everybody. You're right. And so, that might be funky too. So the whole notion of integrating people into an organization will change. And let's just admit it, it's kind of uncharted territory anyway.
No, totally. I've got a thought for you just to think about, and whether just your thoughts on it really. When we talk about culture in organizations, we talk about it, but we also can start to observe it in an office context, and the feel of it, the social side of things, how certain people interact, how certain groups are together, the coffee sort of room and the lunch, all that sort of cultural things. What are your thoughts on how we get that across in a virtual sort of digital sense?
I would just like to finally admit that you can't. I don't think you can. I mean, I've read a lot about, you do it on Zoom through this way and you don't talk about business on it. But I don't think there's any flaw or weakness in saying that some things simply cannot be replicated. They're being substituted. And as we become more comfortable, for everything you lose, you gain something. I did read somewhere that the closeness of our faces on Zoom and the intensity would be in a real, not virtual life, something like 5 centimeters apart. I mean, there's a psychological intensity to it that I think can be very bonding in a one-on-one way, the way I like to think you and I have. But in a team, I think you got to carve it up to the smallest pairings and then shuffle the deck with new pairings and keep mixing it up, because otherwise you really can't replicate spontaneity. And that's what you're losing, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Oh my
Definitely.
goodness, we are out of time. So I just have to thank Leo. You were here watching live and commented. Loved having you here, and everyone else. And of course, Julian, I will see you next week when you get to host. Yippee.
Absolutely. Good to see you again, Nancy. Take care.
Good to see you. Bye, everybody.
Bye.